How close were the Romans to an industrial revolution? After all, archaeology reveals they were already innovating on the use of advanced technologies like gears, ball bearings, and steam engines, whilst applying their ingenuity at scale with complex water power facilities, mass production workshops, and infrastructure projects of unparalleled scope. Today we all know the empire eventually fell, but at its height, Rome represented one of the civilizational peaks against which many of their successors would be measured. Even to this day, we still live in the long shadows of their buildings, their institutions, and their culture. This raises the question, what if they didn't fall? How far off were they from the 18th century industrial revolution of our own timeline? Now often these sorts of discussions spiral into wild speculation and fevered dreams of a Roman future. But today, I wanted to discuss the topic with a bit more nuance. To do so, we'll look at what factors gave rise to the actual Industrial Revolution, assess how comparable these were to the Roman era, and dive into the level of industrialization we actually see present in antiquity. And thus, finally, seek to determine how close was Rome to an industrial revolution. So if you're like me and you love getting immersed in historical games, you're definitely going to want to check out today's sponsor, Bellwright. Bellwright is a single-player or co-op open-world medieval game with survival, strategy, and sim elements. The overall narrative sees you return to your homeland to pick up the pieces of your past and lead a rebellion against the corrupt powers which have taken hold of the land. You start off with just a lowly camp in the wilderness. However, through hunting, gathering, and crafting, you survive and begin to thrive. By exploring the world, you will then be able to level up through a progression system and rally others to your cause. Add recruits as companions to complete quests, or assign them to build, craft, or hunt in order to expand your settlement. In time, these specialists will unlock more advanced structures and technologies for you to use. Villagers can also be equipped and trained as warriors. Bellwright not only lets you join these troops in combat as a fighter, but you can also serve as an actual commander with control over their squads and formations. Eventually, you'll lead entire armies into the field, liberating the lands to grow the rebellion, and ultimately challenging the crown and its royal army. Bellwright is out now in early access on Steam for both single and co-op play, so definitely if this sounds like the game for you, check it out using the link in the description to learn more, and dive on in. Enjoy! So let's discuss how close the Romans were to an industrial revolution. It's a very comprehensive topic where we could get into many details. We felt that it warranted more than our traditional produced episodes, so today we're going to be using more of our long-form discussion format where we can walk you through a board here with lots of information. The general outline that we'll be covering is an introduction into how do we think about these sorts of historical changes, what was the Industrial Revolution, and then in the middle here we're going to be discussing about were the conditions right for Rome? And then finally, we'll be discussing how industrialized were the Romans really. So it's going to be a long discussion here. Feel free to jump ahead in the given timestamps, but otherwise follow along. There'll be some visuals on screen which may enrich the experience, but otherwise you can listen in as a podcast. And joining me today is going to be Chris, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey guys, I'm Chris. I'm a Roman historian. I've been working with Invicta for a few years now, and so if you've seen some of our Roman content, that was probably me having something to do with it. My background is, obviously, in Roman history, and I actually specialize in social and economic history, which is translated, it's history of the common person. So this topic is actually going to be a really interesting one that I'm very keen to talk about.
Excellent. Yes, and you're going to be a great co-host for this. So let's start up at the top with introductions. So again, the premise here is how close was Rome to being industrialized? A lot of people are super intrigued about this. And there's been fancy talk of, well, if they had industrialized, would we be living in a completely different future? No doubt, yes. But what is the case of that happening? So really to frame this conversation, first, there was some kind of macro topics that Chris and I wanted to talk about. The first is this idea of kind of inevitability of progress, and the fallacy in particular of a linear style progress of technologies and the convenience of historical eras. So diving into each of these, tech trees are very familiar to us, especially those who game in historical settings. You always see this in all of these, civilization style games. You research a technology which unlocks future technologies, and they lead progressively and inevitably one after another chaining you on to some future level. So you can imagine in these games, there is sometimes literally an industrial revolution track that you kind of, check the boxes and you get there. That is very much a matter of how the game presents it, but that's not how history plays out. So that's the first thing we wanted to kind of debunk, is this idea of linear tech trees. The other thing also is this idea of historical eras. Oftentimes, just for convenience, historians and people who are trying to teach, when you're first learning about the world, you're learning about history, it's very obvious that you have to simplify things. That leads us to making these convenient historical eras. And the more you look into a historical era, the more that historical era blurs and is not evenly or cleanly defined. Take the Bronze Age collapse. Some might even be misnomers of those periods. So there's all sorts of issues of trying to define these historical eras, very much non-uniform, very much non-standardized, especially when you expand your scope beyond just, say, Europe or England or whatever. The world is constantly in flux, completely non-uniform. So that's essentially the from the get-go, the fallacy that we wanted to tackle. So Chris, if you have any thoughts on this before we kind of move on.
Yeah, and as someone who is frankly inspired into history by tech tree video games, I love Civ 3, heck, Civ 2, Civ 4. Those were my jam. That was actually one of the hardest things to wrap my head around, was the idea of technology is not predefined, as it were. It's not something that, oh yeah, we just got enough tech points and now we unlocked something. It's entirely based on the situation in the place, which may or may not be discovering a technology. Oftentimes, people don't necessarily need a thing. They're doing just fine with what they have, and so there's no real impetus to change, if that makes sense. And we're really going to get into that later. But yeah, no, I 100% agree that this has to be the place where we start.
Yeah, and one of the things also, that when you take both of these together, there's the tech tree, there's the eras, they give you this idea that progress is inevitable, that one thing leads to another, and you're always going in one direction. So that is problematic because history isn't always going in one direction. There's rise, there's fall, there's changes in patterns of how we do things. And the ultimate conclusion here is to say it's virtually impossible to predict historical development. There's the Foundation series as a sci-fi setting, both in novelization form and now they have a TV show. And the whole concept behind that is that there is a branch of mathematics that can predict human history. Or history in general. And that's very much not the case, at least in our real world currently. It's virtually impossible to predict historical development. And even more so, there's no real way to measure what level of development you're at currently. You can come up with different indices or whatever for levels of urbanization or economic indices and all that stuff. But we don't really have a good way to rank where we are in terms of progress, let alone forecast, how far away we are from a certain breakthrough. Sometimes progress is glacial. Sometimes it's a rapid explosion. Sometimes we recede. So that's the main thing to knock down here. Moving on from that, kind of what I wanted to posit and seed in our mind for this conversation is this more kind of chaotic view of history, where the idea is history is not static. So if we break free from these linear tech trees and progress, I like to see it more as this kind of system where at a micro level and a macro level, people and civilizations are always dynamically adapting to the challenges of their environment. That's the, you pull on evolution and just kind of how chaotic evolution is, nonlinear it is. That's kind of how you can see our evolution in terms of civilizations. And so what I've done here is basically said, at any given point in time, you can look at an area and you can start to look at what are the challenges, the pressures, evolutionary pressures on a certain set of people or their civilization, be they political, economic, military, environmental, cultural. You can come up with a bunch of different challenges to said group. And then people are always going to try and overcome their challenges or die out. So you're going to try and adapt to these. The ways in which you can try and overcome your challenges are going to be dependent on a variety of things. I've listed some of them here. What is the state of your world? What are the geopolitics, the trade, the wars, etc.? What are the resources that you can tap into? Materials, capital, labor. And then what is the technology, both in terms of your understanding of the theory of the technology and its application. So all of that is going to be a function of where you're at currently, how you're going to solve your challenges, Right here, going from challenge to solution, we've shown it as chaotic. Again, reinforcing the idea that sometimes you hit dead ends, sometimes you make a U-turn, sometimes you have a meandering path that solves the problem, but overall there is no linear path and there's no one from up above as the game player getting you from point A to point B to solve your problems. The last point to make in this system is that there is a feedback loop. You may have a solution, partial or complete, to a given challenge, but whatever you do disturbs your steady state world and is going to feed back and cause ripple effects and create new challenges, exacerbate some, mitigate others. So there's always this feedback loop. So if within just one system, you can see how this is very dynamic. Further to that, what I've done here and what Chris alluded to before is all this is a reflection on where you are maybe in the world. So in this case, I've just brought in one of these generic views of geography. And imagine people here who are in a delta or in a desert or in a plain or in a mountain. The different challenges and what they have at their disposal in terms of tools is going to vary. So the way each of these systems is running is different. Then consider that each of these systems can start to interact with one another. A change in one system can precipitate a change in another. It starts to get complex just in this small, location. Zoom out on the scale of a world, and all of these complex systems interacting leads to complete chaos, we can say. So that's kind of the frame of mind that we wanted to put you guys in as we discuss this topic, is very much complex, sort of evolutionary mindset around technology and pressures on environments and all that, as opposed to the linear, predetermined, preordained tech tree. So that's the framing that we want to have here. I don't know, Chris, if you had any additional thoughts before we move on.
Yeah, I just have one final little chaos agent to throw into the mix here, and that's just human nature. People are not logical creatures. People are not straightforward. Oftentimes, especially when we're playing video games, everybody knows, when you're doing a city builder, for example, you really want to build nice, neat squares and have, your nice parallel lines everywhere. Everything is nice and orderly. Everything works. In real life, you might have someone who doesn't want to build in a square. You might have a road that just goes one way, and that's just because people have just historically gone that way, or maybe it's just the easiest place to put a road. Not everything is going to be nice and predictable. People will generally act on their own self-interest, whatever that interest might be. There's, a running theory that there's no such thing as altruism, because everything people do is in some way, shape, or form for their own benefit, even if that benefit is just making themselves feel good about helping other people. So people aren't predictable. People are not an agent that you, as you said, there's no master, chess master, puppet master up above the scenes that is pulling all the threads. That's not how the world works. You can't ever, frankly, account for the agency of humanity, because that's always going to change some things. So whether or not you have an emperor who happens to be really capricious, or you have a scientist who's just really, really, really obsessed with this weird mold that grew on his bread, right? You can't ever account for what may or may not happen, and what a human being may or may not bring to any given situation.
Yes, and then the last thing I would say is as you get all this churn, so if we're throwing away these tech trees and historical eras and we're moving more so into this world that's kind of chaotic, the last thing I would say is there's like this buildup of these chaotic events that are happening over time, but some of it is retained. Cities get built up, technologies get developed, information gets shared. So with each generation that passes, there is kind of this overall bedrock or accumulated detritus of human achievement and failure that kind of gets built up over this world. And all of that huge pile of history that basically the current living generation is sitting upon informs what they're able to do. So a lot of this is like the Industrial Revolution that we'll get to shortly is not just the current steady state, but it's kind of the world of human past that they're sitting atop that they can draw upon. And just because, let's say somehow you could snap your finger and you take all the inventors of modernity, all the machines of modernity, and you could somehow teleport them to the past, if you don't have that big bedrock of past experience and that detritus of kind of humanity's history, the people and their thoughts and then machines are going to be virtually useless in that world. We might be able to reverse engineer them, but just because you take Einstein's brain from today and slip him back into, a Roman tunic doesn't mean he's going to be able to develop the same way as an individual and influence society in the same way. So there very much could have been someone smarter than Einstein back in the day, but because of the state of the world, they just weren't able to have the same impact. So a lot of that's the final nuance I wanted to put on it, is both you can have great geniuses in the past and you can have them in the future, but what they're able to do is really a matter of where they are in the current state. And the current state is not just what's going on today, but an accumulation of hundreds or thousands of years of development. So it's hard to draw that parallel between Rome and later our modern period or pre-modern period, where we get into the Industrial Revolution. And that's going to be the gist of the conversation that we're going to get into, where we talk about how similar were the starting conditions and how industrialized were the Romans. So that's where we're headed. Where we'll go right now before we tee that off is, well, let's discuss what is this Industrial Revolution in our own world that we just so happen to kind of get into in this time period. So let's talk about that now. And the first thing to stay here for the Industrial Revolution is, again, keep in mind it's this kind of chaotic nature that we've talked about. The Industrial Revolution is not a single event. It's going to be an event, as we're showing up here, where it's gradual. It happens in waves. It's non-uniform. It kind of ebbs and flows and recedes. And really, the only reason we're able to tell that it's an industrial revolution is because we're putting this somewhat arbitrary name onto this period and this series of changes. Something we do retroactively, but it's something that we can do based off some, at least, indices or telltale signs that, there is a drastic change that is causing these otherwise chaotic systems to kind of trend in one direction. And some of these might be, a shift from a largely rural to an urban economy, from domestic systems of manufacturing to, factory systems, from basic material sciences to advanced, basic power sources to advanced power sources. And this might sound generic, but it's kind of a way to categorize some macro level changes that are happening across this time. So yeah, we have here these waves that are being shown. There's a map here that also tries to show the waves of the Industrial Revolution as they come out from Great Britain. And the dates here are roughly 1840 to 1914, but very much continuing on to today. I mean, you see different, there's this idea of developing countries in our own world today. You look at South Korea as it's advanced, over the last 100 years into a super industrialized society. Other places are going through these similar evolutions. So it's very much an ongoing thing. So again, the Industrial Revolution that we're looking at is rather arbitrary, going to be around the mid-1800s. And specifically, Chris, I'll let you touch on maybe some other telltale signs that you think are indicative of the period that we're trying to equivocate with Rome.
Yeah, so really, again, we're trying to, we're trying to take a whole huge amount and distill it into a relatively small amount of stuff. I know this is going to be a really relatively long episode, but it's still going to be extremely distilled. So what we're going to be looking at very specifically is the development of Britain in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, give or take a little bit. And we're going to be looking at and assessing that as our Industrial Revolution state. So again, there's going to be a huge amount of other that we could include. We could look at examples from all over the world. Again, we could look at the industrialization of Japan or Korea or another place, almost anywhere. But we're going to be looking at Britain just because, that's the place where most historians can agree that the industrialization of the world did begin, relatively speaking. We can really look at it as a set of relatively defined features. And as I like to term, we can kind of get the understanding that Britain, here are the ingredients that Britain had in its secret sauce. Can we apply those same things to Rome, and maybe what was missing?
Yep. And specifically, this is a topic of conversation where when you even ask, why did it happen in Britain in the first place, there's a ton of answers. You can look at colonialism, all these other factors. Chris and I have worked down a slightly slimmed down list that we'll be comparing. So it'll be, conditions of political stability, agricultural productivity, availability of water, key natural resources, and a willingness to kind of extrapolate upon these. So that's the framework that we're coming into on this intro. So with that being said, I think we can now move on to, were the conditions right, comparing those of Great Britain and Rome. All right, so now let's discuss, were the conditions right? The format for this section is going to be comparing Rome versus Great Britain at these two rough time periods, and we're going to be seeing what is the state of affairs of the conditions of Great Britain during or right at the start of the Industrial Revolution versus Rome in the period where we're thinking, were they about to industrialize? So we'll be comparing those two and seeing where the gaps may exist as it relates to different kind of thematic areas. But just to get you started, let's actually look at the time period and in a rough map, which again is going to be an approximation, a simplification. But generally speaking, for the Industrial Revolution, we're looking at about early 1800s world. The Great Britain, as it relates to continental Europe here, is going to be confined largely to the British Isles, and you can see here the Industrial Revolution spreading to the continent from there. Looking further abroad with respect to the world, the British Empire, this is where you get the sun never sets idea. There is going to be, Britain as its islands, but then these colonies, far-flung trade routes influence all that, work in extract resources, etc., and do exchanges of trade with the broader world. Looking at the comparison for Rome, we're looking roughly in the 1st to 2nd centuries AD. So Rome is huge at this point in terms of landmass that it controls, which includes part of Britannia. But a large, expansive landmass, obviously access to many resources and people. And then if you look at the wider world here, Rome actually does have its tendrils that expand out beyond just the confines of the Mediterranean. On the fringes of the world, it does have its colonies and client states where it is able to extract a lot of resources in a somewhat similar way to the British Empire, but that is not as firmly established when you get to the further flung reaches of these trade routes, say in China or Southeast Asia or even India. Rome is certainly in connection, but doesn't quite yet have the same level of colonizing penetration that the later empires of the world will have. So that is it at a high level, just to baseline where we're talking about comparatively here. But Chris, any comments here before we start slicing things up by topic?
Yeah, actually, I'd just want to highlight a small logistical aspect while we're looking at these maps. So while we look at these maps, and again, I know many of our viewers maybe like looking at the lines on maps, part of what you see here is the dependence of civilizations in general in the pre-modern world on water. All of the major settlements and population centers are either based around rivers or access to the sea in general. Britain's vast overseas colonial empire all was based around having access to the sea. And then in Rome, if we look at the map of Rome, you see Rome's immense population area is all focused around access to the sea or the Mediterranean Sea in general. The best example being where you have this tiny strip of Africa, only because there are no more inland rivers there. So that's one thing to highlight while we're looking at these maps. Obviously, it would take 1,000 maps to try to tell the whole story of, different aspect of, these resources are located here. This had a strength over here that this did not. The British Empire was able to do this because of this. We can't show all of that here. But that's just one small little highlight that while we're looking at these maps, I figured I'd point out.
Yeah, and even if we painted, I think the end point to make here is, even if these maps were literally identical in terms of painting the map red, so to speak, be it with a British flag or a Roman flag, the underlying mechanisms of what is going on under that paint that we've drawn is what's really important. And that's what we'll be getting into as we get into these different sections. And so we have different topics that we'll be slicing this into to say, were the conditions right? What happened in the Industrial Revolution? What happened in the Roman period? And the first one we'll start at is political stability. So that is a key ingredient to allowing you to have forward progress is if things are stable. So Chris, you want to walk us through the Industrial Revolution and then kind of the situation for Rome?
Yeah, so earlier in this episode, I mentioned that the human element is potentially the most problematic with regards to any progress in general. The human element is the reason that you have governmental instability. And so that can look like almost anything. We're going to kind of distill it again, focusing on Britain here. In this period, in the early 1800s, Britain was a very, 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 very stable nation. You do have, if you look at a timeline of the British Empire, you have civil wars. No one's denying that. You have some instability here and there. No one's denying that. Even in this timeline that we're showing up on screen now, you have a relatively major piece of instability there with the Cromwells taking over and then the crown being restored, etc., etc., etc. Before that, you had the Magna Carta, but you always had the stability of the bureaucracy, always underlaying everything. Despite any drama with the British crown, you never really had an overthrow of the entire system, different claimants trying to rush in, massive wars being fought, tearing the British Empire apart. The American Revolution, yeah, that had happened, but that was a colony. This was Britain at its core. So we're going to go ahead and compare that to the Romans. Now, as I noted here, I really do love the Romans. I do. I love studying them. I think they're fascinating. They were on par, in a modern perspective, an incredibly unstable empire. When we think of, the stability of Rome, you have the Pax Romana. But Chris, you have the Pax Romana. If you think of how many civil wars or minor insurrections happened during the Pax Romana, that makes you rethink what the meaning of peace in Rome was. For example, the third Roman emperor, that was Caligula. He was murdered. Then the fifth Roman emperor was Nero, and he was murdered, and there was a civil war between 4 different generals who each started in different corners of the Roman world and fought each other to the death in the year 69. And then after that, it only took 3 more emperors before another one was murdered again. And that was Domitian, and his fall started up the 5 good emperors. What I'm trying to get at here is Rome didn't have periods of very, 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 very long stability. It had an absolute monarchy and a constant reduction in the power of the Senate. Whereas Britain was kind of the opposite, where the parliament kept getting stronger and stronger. Even in Rome's more peaceful periods, like, again, the 5 good emperors, they had constant threats of invasion, of plague, of offensive war, defensive war. They were constantly at war with both Persia and the Dacians and people from across the Danube, all at the same time. That's always going to cause a small element of instability. When you also combine that with the fact that they didn't really have a defined system of inheritance that actually remained stable, you didn't have a super legally defined system of government, frankly, until you get to the Byzantines. That all leads to instability. One example that I used earlier, and that kind of drives it home in a modern perspective, is that the Roman Empire in some ways was about as stable as some states in sub-Saharan Africa, where you see these constant coups, insurrections, generals deciding that they could probably do better than the guy in charge, a guy in charge declaring that he's going to stay on forever even if he's not really supposed to. That's the kind of instability Rome had. So it is, in some ways, pretty incomparable to the British Empire's continuity, as it were. So what was missing between the two? You just never had that system of transition. You never had that nice, strong baseline, and you never had a counterbalance to the monarchy that Parliament really provided for the British.
Yeah, and if we want to dumb things down where we say society or whatever is organized, call it simply a pyramid or something. If the top is always getting collapsed and that just rains down on people and destabilizes the whole structure, that's going to cause a lot of disruption. And maybe be at the very base level. Maybe the day-to-day lives of any given person isn't changed by these vast emperors and their squabbles. The swaying of this tower at the top does have a lot of destabilizing and negative effects on development. And it's really only as you kind of firm up the structures of the societal pyramid with better institutions of government that aren't at the, the beck and call of some crazy emperor or whatever. It's only once you get the maturity of those institutions that you can start to get your structure enough stability to withstand these changes in temperament and whatever. So that's really important. So you have at the base, again, I think we do have to admit that everyday farmers probably didn't care who was emperor or who was reigning in charge. They just go ahead and they're their farmer. So at the base, it doesn't change maybe so much, but the middle and the top, it certainly changes a lot. And it's the instability of the Romans that causes that to sway and causes problems. And it's really kind of that group that is key to having some stability and continuity to allow you to do this forward progress. Yeah, so that's basically political stability. We can then move on to agricultural productivity. Chris, again, if you want to set us up for the Industrial Revolution and compare it to the Romans.
I would absolutely love to. One of the most fascinating things about the Industrial Revolution is that it coincided with something that we also call the Agricultural Revolution, which was, in some ways, it was just an accumulation. We had an accumulation of human knowledge that just hit a tipping point and moved us into almost a different world where farms were able to produce so much more, that they were able to feed so many more people, that they required a lot less work, or a lot less manpower, as it were, for a much greater result. So you have all of these advancements. Again, some of these stem back all the way to the early Middle Ages. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a lot of people like to say there was, the Dark Ages. Everyone went, backwards in time. Well, no, they didn't. They just adapted to the current situation. And some of the things that they really advanced in was agriculture in that time period. So you have things like the heavy plow, which it seems like a relatively small thing, but it's a very deep plow that takes the turf and turns it upside down. So the more nutritious earth is at the top, and you can grow more crops. You have different systems of crop rotation, which allow you to only leave a smaller field fallow at any given time, or perhaps just sow a different crop on it that reintroduces nutrients to that soil that other crops take out of it. You have a full economic reformation where farmers are more recognized as an institution, and they're more supported by the governments, and their crops are better distributed by a central force. You have horse collars, which again sounds relatively minor. It was an invention during the Middle Ages, but it allowed them to use horses to plow things instead of using oxen. And horses are a lot stronger in some ways and a lot better for this purpose, but you just need the ability to harness them, and that's what the horse collar allowed for. So all of these things all came together, and yeah, the Industrial Revolution, they were still mostly using horsepower. We think of, all the steampunk world. No, it was horses a lot of the time. All these things all came together, and agricultural production increased, like estimates are in the hundreds of percents, not a small number, just like 10, 20, 30, 40 times what they were usually able to do, sometimes 400 times as much. And so you have a lot of people moving from these farms into the cities. When people move from the farms into the cities, they need jobs, they need things to do. So you start having these larger scale factories build up. And these factories are able to start off with manufacturing industries. And so these industries really began to develop of these large-scale factories producing a large-scale number of goods. And one thing left to another, and you guys can kind of see where the domino effect is going here. So this never would have happened without that agricultural revolution.
And a big part is, I guess, just to draw a parallel to the dawn of civilization, the unlocking this agricultural productivity frees up people to do specialization. In this case, we're going to be specialized to do other things.
Exactly. And so, let's compare that to Rome. Well, Rome was very similar to that pre-industrial world, where you have somewhere between 18 and 20% probably people living in the cities, but most people just lived with their family farm. They stayed in the same village where they always had. They did the same things. They married similar people, and they stayed in the same spots. They didn't change. They didn't all flock to the cities and start up factories because Why would they do that? Their family needs those hands, you know? And they used the ox for plowing. They had a huge amount of work to be able not only to plant the farms, but to maintain the farms, to weed the things, and then to harvest them. That was a lot of work, required a lot of manpower, and so all those people were essentially spread out. And you didn't have that concentration of humanity so much. Obviously, you had great cities like Rome and Alexandria and Constantinople, but you didn't have the critical tipping point there.
Yeah, and you have this nice map as well on the right. Did you want to rope that into your conversation where the distribution of population is also maybe important?
Yeah, the population dispute. That's actually one of the reasons I included this map. And going back to our conversation, in that we'd need 1,000 maps to tell the full story, right? This distorted map kind of shows where people lived. So each little box is bigger, the more people lived there. And so you see this very, it's simultaneously spread out quite a bit more than you might expect, especially with the modern world, where you see a huge amount more urbanization. But also, you can definitely see where the cities are. The few cities where people really accumulated: Rome, Alexandria, some places in Greece, and Constantinople. So you have the rural regions really ruling the roost in the Roman world.
Awesome. And what would you say would be missing then to get us from the Romans, who maybe have the same level of urbanization as pre-industrial Britain? Maybe it's somewhat comparable, but what's missing for Rome to be able to make that leap into kind of unlocking this productivity?
Yeah, weird as it is to say, it's just that 1600 years. Sometimes things just take time, and it's going back to what you said at the top of the episode. There's an accumulation of human knowledge that kind of sometimes just all builds up, and we build up on, frankly, past failures, the mistakes of, people before us. And one actual really good example of this is, over time, farmers select for seeds that simply are more productive. Oftentimes today we call that GMO, or genetic modification. It's just selection for what works better. So perhaps you have a strain of wheat that simply makes bigger wheat. It just gives you twice as much. The farmer is going to plant a lot more of that. And sometimes those mutations take thousands of years to come along, right? So, especially when, you don't have an industrialized process for doing it. So when you get to the Industrial Revolution, you finally have all this. Rome just didn't have that 1600 years going for it. And that's simply, well, that's just the way time works.
Perfect. So, yes, we've touched on now political stability, which keeps things relatively stable so that you can start to make advanced progress, and institutions are stable enough for people to make longer term investments. You have agricultural productivity, which now ramps up, which allows people to actually focus on the things that they might not other have to do for subsistence or whatever. And you get a critical mass of people, so you can get specialization and take advantage of the stability. And then now we start to get into, well, now people are able to do things. Well, what do they have at their disposal? So here we're going to be covering water, which is a key one for transportation and power, water and natural resources. And then finally, we'll bring it together with kind of worldviews. So we'll start here with water being a critical component that's often the unsung hero of a lot of what we do. So Chris, talk about it.
Yeah. So going all the way back again, I did tease a few things at the top of the episode, didn't I? We have civilizations that are entirely built around access to water, not only for drinking or bathing or whatever else you might use water for. Transportation and power are both the greatest strengths of water in our world, frankly. Historically, cities have been built around rivers, not just because of water access, but because that lets you get something from point A to point B really relatively easily. I don't want to say every civilization, but the Greeks and Romans especially realized that, you can actually use things like currents for power as well. So you can use a running river, and you can harness that with a water wheel, and it turns things, and you can use those turny things to do work. So you have the logistics, you have power in general, at the very most base definition, and you have As a result of all this, you have things like trade routes that start forming, because maybe you want to get to point B because point B is where they make really good pots, and you happen to make really good olive oil. So you need the pots from point B to bring them to your olive oil place, and then you can maybe send some olive oil back to point B because now you have a pot to carry the olive oil in. You do that with water. Again, that sounds a little bit reductive, but if you have your trading ships, your barges, etc., you can really send your trade networks far and wide. And so that's why we have this map here, where the Romans harnessed their water power almost to an unprecedented degree. They controlled the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea, which connected their entire empire. That's essentially how Rome maintained its stability for so long, is it was just all really, really, really well connected. Britain, very similar, on a much larger scale, simply because they had better shipbuilding techniques, they had larger ships, they had more masts, they had better sails, they had better technology for putting all of these things together. Don't get me wrong, the Romans had really, really relatively good ships, and that's actually something I'm personally fascinated by, is the extent of their trade networks to the Far East, to India and China and such, where we've actually found Roman coins in Vietnam. That's about how far we're looking. They had barges that could make it across that Indian Ocean and back before the typhoon season. They were massive, massive trade ships that are actually on the scale of some of these British trade ships. But they couldn't quite make it across things like the Atlantic, which is a completely different beast. There are no land ports you can stop in every night, for example. So the Romans were actually very much on par with the British in some respects with regards to taking advantage of the power of their water, of their trade networks, of their internal communications networks. But what was missing was really just again, going right back to what I said earlier, 1,600 years of development. Their ships just simply were more primitive than the British ships. They didn't have all the different technologies that would allow them to really embrace that world-spanning empire. A small trip where you can stop every night, great. But a multi-week trip? No, that would be unheard of in the Roman world. So that would be really the big thing that was missing, the big tipping point. And going even into the Industrial Revolution a little bit, the innovation of the steamship completely changed the world, because you didn't have to think of when is the wind blowing and where is it blowing to? What's the prevailing wind? Where's the current going? You could then just ignore all of that and do your own thing. But we'll get to that later.
Yes. So, yes, water allows you to move goods around. It expands how much you can trade, communicate, do all that stuff. But let's say you have access to these lands, and let's assume Rome and Great Britain at the time were equivalent. Well, what is the comparison in terms of the natural resources that they can exploit? So again, Chris, I'll let you do a comparison between what is going on in both of these different time periods that's relevant to our conversation.
Yeah, so it's one of those funny things. Rome literally owned Britain for the most part. So Rome very much had access to all of the natural resources that Britain had in a very raw, theoretical fashion. I can see that we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Frankly, Rome controlled much more in the way of easily exploitable and transportable resources than the British Empire did in the early 1800s. The British certainly had more range to their empire, but Rome had less range and probably a similar number of resources, which just reduces shipping costs. That's relatively unimportant, but Britain was able to harness 1,600 years of innovation, and they realized that they had certain things that they could exploit and make better. So things like coal, and the Romans knew about coal, but usually what they used it for was to seal ships, to essentially to make them more watertight. they didn't really burn coal all that much, except in some of the British border forts for heat. They didn't use it as an alternative fuel source. They used wood or charcoal, frankly, as their primary fuel source, which is, in the modern parlance, coal is much, much, much more efficient. There's a lot more energy packed inside a lump of coal than a piece of charcoal. So that really helped to propel the British, because they were able to use that coal to, say, make a steam engine work and make that work efficiently. The British had very high quality iron, which again, the Romans had access to it, but they didn't have the years of innovation that the British did. They didn't realize why that iron was really, really, really good, and they didn't realize how to turn that iron into very high quality steel. That's something we'll talk about a little bit later, because steel deserves its own section. That's how crucial steel was to, frankly, the entire industrialization of the world. Britain was also a very, very rich country. Rome was also a very, very, very rich empire. That's almost an incomparable point. Both of them had capital that they could pour into projects that they wanted to. And that's something that we'll also highlight, is that Rome had a whole bunch of large, innovative projects. They had massive scale production facilities, but they didn't necessarily have the accumulation that all of this would take. And so you guys are probably really seeing a theme here, in that there's this accumulation of knowledge that eventually spills over. While Rome had theoretical access to all this stuff, they even had a bunch of technology that they invented to exploit it. Like, for example, we see the Archimedean screw, which basically helped them make shaft mines. And they were able to move water really, really, really well, and they developed machines that would make them able to do it more efficiently. They were simply stuck in what's called a paradigm, and they didn't have the impetus to really break that paradigm, move around it, and into a new paradigm.
Great. So this is the culmination of all the different topics we've talked about, comparing and contrasting the two. There could be more, cards and themes we could talk about here. The nature of exploitative colonies, the population densities. There's all kinds of different cards we could talk about, and maybe we'll expound on that in future episodes. But by and large, we wanted to conclude saying, hey, these are the major ones that we thought we identified. And the important last note here to make is, a couple things are pooling out of this. Rome and Great Britain may have been somewhat similar, but even if they were on paper, like we saw with water here, able to access the same things, the real difference is the sheer amount of accumulated technology that changes. And then a change in one of these particular realms, you can't just be equivalent in one of them, because a change in one will flow out into a change in the other. As we saw, just changing the dial on agricultural productivity will let you then have perhaps better political stability, which then lets you better exploit natural resources. So it's really a combination of all of these. You can't just have one that matches. All of these kind of have to be set to the right the right secret sauce at the right time, at this coincidentally. So the interplay of all these is really key. And the last one to bring it all together is, even if you had all these being key, there's also the whole human element of how do we interact with this world, understand the world, and go about this world. So this is how Chris wanted to conclude this section, was in discussing worldviews as it relates to all these topics.
Yeah, and philosophy is one of those words that, like logistics, makes people fall asleep. It's really, really, really easy to be like, philosophy, it's an airy-fairy thing. Well, yes, but also, philosophy in this respect is also, how do we think about science? How do we think about the world? You and I might think, we go into the house, we flip on the light, and we open the faucet because we're a little bit thirsty, and get some water into our glass, and then we're going to drink and sit down and watch some TV. Those words would have been completely incomprehensible 100 years ago, give or take. 200 years ago, they would have accepted that you were just talking gibberish and thrown you into a mental asylum. What we have here is kind of what is termed as a paradigm. It's essentially the box in which you're thinking. And so we've got a nice little diagram down here that kind of illustrates how it works. You have your little box, and your box is very comfy. You want to stay in your box because that's how the world works. Outside of the box is, frankly, it's sometimes impossible to think about. For an easy example, people a few hundred years ago, or a few hundred years from now, might think, oh yeah, no, flying cars, yeah, that's just, a run-of-the-mill thing. All you have to do is make an anti-gravity generator. It's really not a problem. You just have to make sure your fusion pieces are correctly aligned, and boom, easy peasy. To us, that makes no sense. And so that's how you have to think of paradigms, is a lot of things outside of your box make absolutely no sense to you inside your box, just because you can't really conceptualize how it works. When you start realizing that there are some of those things that break the rules and they start drifting into your box and you can't really ignore them, then you start having like an internal, oh, shoot, I've got to change where my box goes. So your box might look more like an oval as it bulges to try to accommodate these things. And one of the examples of that is actually in astronomy. So with the geocentric view of the universe, they had excellent forecasts for everything from planetary movement to the moon phases, etc., etc., etc. Heck, they could predict the tides. They were really, really, really good at that, even though their box was incorrect. The solar system revolves around the sun, not the Earth. But the way they had to do it was they had to kind of make excuses for things that just didn't quite fit. Like, for example, at one point in the planet's rotation, you can actually see some of the other planets that seem to go backwards in relation to the Earth. And that's just because, we're all rotating around the sun. It doesn't make sense if they're rotating around the Earth. But, you've got to make things fit in your box. So those planets were just doing loop-de-loops. That's what the explanation was. And it still kind of made sense until we learned more and we had to be like, oh, well, the universe doesn't revolve around the Earth. We just simply revolve around the sun. And that's the paradigm that we live in now. So that's how a model revolution works, is you just completely throw away the box and make a new box. And so then we get back to normal with our new box until we have to shift our box again. The Romans were in an entirely different universe with regards to boxes than the British. There were multiple boxes that had happened in between that point A and point B. And so it was completely, in some ways, impossible for the Romans to conceive of a lot of these technological drifts that you see the British undertaking in the Industrial Revolution. We've got here diagrams of things even like humoral theory, which is the Roman theory of that there are, your four elements, your fire, your water, your earth, your air, and that dictates how the world works. Well, by the 1800s, people were pretty sure that, there might be a little bit something more to the universe than that. You actually had early atomic theory resurfacing right around this time. It started off, actually, with Democritus in ancient Greece, but then you start seeing it come back and people being like, well, actually, we don't think it's just fire, earth, air, and water. We've got to change our entire worldview. So that's really where that whole 1600 years of accumulated knowledge comes in. It's not just the knowledge, it's the changing of how you think. And that's really the difference between the Romans and why it was probably impossible for them to have an industrial revolution, is just because they couldn't comprehend the idea in some ways.
Yeah, and just to drive that point home is a lot of the, you mentioned agricultural productivity, understanding why fields might be productive or not, necessitates an understanding of maybe how genetics works or how the chemical composition of the soil plays into it. All of these advances, and that goes back to our earlier point about understanding how you solve your problems, is all a function of kind of your worldview and the tools at your disposal. So that's really different when you're thinking about how to solve problems and you're worried about placating the gods or what miasma might be, causing the crops to spoil. The potential solutions are going to be very much different than if you're thinking about it with the framework of understanding how gravity works or how germ theory works and things like that. So there's huge difference that this is maybe one of the biggest ones that there's no real cheat sheet that unlocks this new mind of thinking. Humanity has to do the mental exercise of, hundreds of years to really get to this point.
Exactly. And that's why I made this little meme at the end there, where it's, what's better, 100,000 slaves or one really strong steam turbine? Would you prefer to have a nuclear power plant or 100,000 people able to do that work? I'm pretty sure the nuclear power plant could outperform that 100,000 people.
Yes. But if you handed it to the Romans, they'd be like, I don't want this stack of concrete.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It looks kind of dumb. It's one building. Obviously, this other thing is worth more because it probably cost more. Like, my goodness. Yeah, so it's just a way you gotta change the way you're thinking. And that's just really hard.
So yeah, hopefully that gives us an understanding of how the conditions were vastly different between the two. Next, what we'll be tackling is, given that difference, maybe the Romans weren't in the right condition to do the same type of industrialization, but how industrialized were the Romans? Okay, so for this next section, let's cover then how industrialized were the Romans. We've broken this up into a variety of different topics. Again, there's probably infinitely more areas that we could delve into. For now, we've kind of broadly grouped it into the sources of power that they're tapping into, the material science that they use to then, extract that power in combination with the means and methods that they've developed to finally basically extract energy, power, productivity from the land and use it for the advancement of civilization. So we're going to see where the Romans were roughly at. Again, we're going to try and skim through a lot of this because it's so dense. But yes, if you want to learn more, we'll be able to provide links to access the whole document. So yeah, with that being said, let's get started with the sources of power, starting with the human and animal element. So Chris, I'll let you start off here.
Yeah, so this is probably what you think of when you think of ancient Roman powering anything, is you think of, well, they had people to do it. And that's exactly correct. They used people and they used animals. So, your horses, oxen, donkeys, you name it, they used it. It's one of the less efficient forms of power there is. Like, getting machines to do things is almost always better than getting a person to do that similar thing. But you do have the benefit of being able to direct them to do something. Human beings are very efficient in that direction, where they can do more than just one task. So sometimes it was a little bit more useful. Overall, it was much less efficient than using an alternative form of power. For example, the last image I've included here is actually a grain grinding operation. So when you want to grind your grain, you basically make one big wheel and you have spokes on the wheel and you push it in opposite directions. That can be with animals like the donkey here, or it can be with people, generally slaves, and it would be heavy, grueling, incredibly boring labor. And that was a huge amount of labor that was done in the Roman world, simply because if you weren't next to a river, you couldn't harness that current for water power to do things like this.
Yes, so if you were to compare the two worlds, Rome is very much still the dial set to human and animal power as opposed to mechanized industrial power that we'll see being kind of the hallmark of the Industrial Revolution. So very much human animal power. One thing we'll note here is there is this, maybe pop culture idea that all Roman power is by slaves, which, yes, much of the Roman economy was leveraging the usefulness of slaves. But Chris, I know you wanted to add a little bit of nuance there in terms of, actually, they just used underpaid people a lot of the time, too. It wasn't always the slaves who were kind of the backbone of the human labor pool.
Yeah, so a really interesting anecdote is, especially for some of the more dangerous places, I like to say one of the commonly very well-known little stories is that rowers on ships, the people who pulled the oars, they were actually paid professionals. That really started with the Greeks, and the Athenians were very well known for this, but the Romans did it too. They had paid professionals pulling their oars because they needed to be good at their job. And they needed to be synchronized, and that's something that paid labor is simply better at doing. One less known anecdote, though, is, for example, with mining and mining operations. Those were very, 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 very dangerous jobs. People generally had lower life expectancies for it, and it was way cheaper to hire some underpaid civilian and let them do it than it was to buy a slave and recognize that slave is only going to last for a year or two. So oftentimes for these really, really, really terrible jobs, they didn't even bother using slaves. They just paid people a very small amount of money. And you still see people who do that today. Maybe they're less educated. They don't understand that they're just signing their life away for a relatively small paycheck. But that's simply the way the world works. Human exploitation is not a pretty thing. Don't get me wrong, these slaves often had really terrible lives. The vast majority of them did not have good lives. But sometimes it was cheaper to pay someone to do something than it was to buy someone to do something.
All right, and then moving on to our other sources of power that we can tap into across the planet, getting outside of the human and the animal, we're looking at different ones. So one of them would be just, well, we have a big nuclear reactor in the sky. Can we harness the sun in some way? Obviously, in our modern times, we can do that in all kinds of ways, concentrated solar power to create, literally electricity, all kinds of other ways that we actually tap into the sun today. In the Roman era, there was actually a sense of being able to use the sun. So they use this for some passive heating designs. Chris, I know you're a fan of talking about how this was commonplace in the baths and the hospitals where they have, orientation of the building is trying to maximize the amount of sunlight coming in to get your passive heating. So the Romans are very much aware of this. And you had tagged on some notes here talking about, well, they actually use the sun for production of goods, drying clothes, producing salts, dehydrating foods, things of that nature. So the Romans were very much kind of tapping into it, but at a very base level that doesn't require so much an understanding of the physics involved. But they started to kind of creep into some of that when you get into lensing, mirrors and lenses. We have some evidence that they actually had, these magnifying glasses as either for reading or perhaps even starting fire. And this comes to a point with Archimedes, if you want to talk about that one.
I do, although I'm going to break a lot of hearts here. The story of Archimedes setting ships on fire is a myth. He did not do that. The mirrors and magnifying glasses that they had at that period in time would not have been able to make a giant solar laser. I know, it's quite tragic. I was really disappointed when I first learned that as well. It's not a true story, but the idea is there, and it's kind of it's illustrative of what the Romans could do. I mean, you could start a little fire with a handheld mirror. Generally, the mirrors they had were not as burnished. They didn't, have the technology to necessarily make silver nitrate to cover a thing and make a perfectly smooth mirror. Many of their mirrors were made of things like brass, which might give a slightly distorted image. It would reflect light, depending on how well it was polished, but not necessarily to the degree that we see mirrors today. They didn't have quite the level of glass making technology that we'd have to make enough magnifying glasses for like really high quality solar lasers. Just, for a hypothetical example. That being said, they did invent glass making in general. So they did know what they were doing with regards to the sun makes things hot. They didn't, as you said, Julian, understand the physics behind that necessarily.
Yeah, or have the material sciences or the means and methods to fully exploit it. And we'll get into that in a second. But yes, so solar power, like you said, they know the sun makes things hot. You can use that heat to do things. Talking about heat, another source of power potentially is geothermal power. Again, we tap into that, getting energy and heat out of the ground and using it for our own purposes. The Romans kind of did that, but mostly for pleasure, to be honest. Drawing it up for architectural reasons, using it for, holy sites or just to soak in it. So the Romans did tap into geothermal, but it was really kind of sit on top of it and not so much convert it into another form of power.
Exactly. You have these usually with the Roman geothermal, harnessing geothermal power, you have them basically just building on top of hot springs and around hot springs very, very, very specifically. You don't see them really tapping the earth so much as using what is there. So some of these more famous sites are the town of Bath in Britain, which literally has a Roman bath, built on top of a hot spring that was extremely famous for its mineral properties. I would not recommend drinking the water when you're there. It Well, I mean, they do have a filtered version that doesn't have amoebas in it, but don't drink amoeba water. It's not good for you. The Romans liked these hot springs because they warmed up the baths. And eventually they actually were like, hey, we want to have baths that aren't on top of hot springs. So they actually developed technologies to imitate that, simply because the circumstances were there, the needs were there, and so they adapted to that. But yeah, so they did use that geothermal energy that was there, just not necessarily in a way that we might think of as quote unquote power.
Yes. And touching more on water here, we already mentioned this, tapping into water just as a surface through which you can more easily transport materials. Definitely they were on top of that, tapping into roots, either be they river or seas, or maybe even building their own canals or their own aqueducts and things like that. So definitely on top of it, massive projects in terms of dredging, creation of ports on an incredible scale. So they were tapping into that side of it. But then the other side of water that you can tap into is obviously, water, because of gravity, will flow from an area of different potentials, from high to low potential. As it moves, there's kinetic energy in the water, and you can tap into that. And so the Romans were actually aware of this. They built reservoirs. The aqueducts were all about bringing water from one place to another. Along the way, using that pressure and the movement of the water to do different things, either to do a water fountain, or to do your plumbing, or to wash the streets or whatever. But then also using it to turn wheels. So water wheels is a big technology. Once you get something spinning, you can then use that spinning motion to turn other things. And this time they had actually a gear system that allowed you to convert the rotation in a different direction and do the thing that otherwise you'd have humans or animals doing, which is turning a stone to crush grain. And Chris, you had listed here other examples of things that they did. So, crushing grain, or actually running a saw, cutting marble, hammering things, even kneading dough. So they were starting to get an understanding of how they could tap into water power.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the things where you see a huge amount of innovation from the Romans. They did invent what's called the vertical shaft gear, which is, if we look at this diagram on the bottom right, it's just a gear that's placed, well, vertically. And then you're not stuck in that one turning rotation. You can actually turn things on a different plane, which is really important when you're trying to grind grain and such. The sawmills and stuff that they used were actually hyper efficient creations. We don't actually have any sites that we know of that were like marble sawing workshops, but we do have some of the marble slabs that were made at those workshops. And we've actually discovered some of them that they've essentially reconstructed, put back together, and realized that some of these saws were over 95% efficient, which is actually an insane number even for the modern world. You usually waste a lot more stone than just 5%. So the Romans were really, really, really good at making these machines that could make power, even if, again, they didn't necessarily have a way to store it, like in electricity or in batteries, or to transmit it to different functions. They understood how that worked and how that could make lives much more efficient and thus cheaper for certain products. Some other really interesting innovations they made with regards to the water mills and these water wheels. They actually made these, I've got diagrams in the bottom portion. We don't really have time to get into it too much here, but they made these triple helix water wheels that today you only really see in wind power. The Romans didn't harness wind power all that much, but you have those. You have double water wheels. You actually have the Romans using their aqueducts to power water wheels to essentially make an artificial river wherever they needed that power. So the Romans really, really, really had a deep understanding of how to use water to their own advantage. Even if whether it was, as Julian said, for drinking, for pleasure, for whatever, but also for work and to make these really, really, really fascinating machines.
All right, and we'll move on, and you can see how these technologies are going to start to mesh. But one of the things we want to tap into is power fire, which you could reduce into more tapping into the chemical properties of different things. But we'll call it firepower for now. And really, this is one place where the Romans were using fire. I mean, that's one of the basic things that mankind learned that set us apart from the animals. Using fire for heating, for war, for whatever. But mostly the Romans were burning tons and tons of fire for the purposes of heating things up, either themselves or materials. When it comes to people, bathhouses are a great example. They had a whole system to run billows that might run for days or months or even maybe even years on end, and distributing that heat and things like that. So very much understanding what fuel is good, how to run that fuel and all that. And then in terms of materials, getting stuff really hot and playing with that material, smelting, glass, pottery, cooking, you name it. And tapping into that, we have clear evidence that the Romans were doing a lot of consumption of wood for the purposes of construction or even burning. Chris, if you want to touch on this, the scale of it.
Yeah, so that's one of the underrated things that you don't hear, because it's not a sexy topic, right? You don't hear people saying that wood was one of the most valuable resources in the Roman world. And it's because it was used for everything. It was their equivalent of, well, power. So it's their light switch, as it were, because you need something to power your lamps, and you need something to give you heat at night. You need something to cook your food. You need something to warm up the bath. You need fuel. And the fuel that they used was wood, or if they wanted a more concentrated version, charcoal. And so you see this vast amount of deforestation around Europe. We actually have a map down here that I was able to find that kind of charts exactly how much logging the Romans did around Europe. It's pretty insane, and it's on par with some of the exploitation of resources you see in the modern world. The Romans didn't use more concentrated forms of fuel. So today we understand oil is an incredible amount of energy in a relatively small bundle. Coal as well is less efficient than oil, but it's still incredibly potent compared to charcoal. The Romans didn't use those things. They used wood and charcoal. So they just logged an immense number of trees. There are actually some allusions in Roman texts of how entire forests were sometimes removed, sometimes it was for building, oftentimes it was for burning, because they needed to fuel their furnaces, whatever those furnaces might be doing at the time. So chemical energy is still one of the foundations of modern life, even if it's in an entirely different form. The Romans very much used and exploited this to a vast degree.
Yeah, and one of the important things to note with these different sources of power that humanity struggled with is getting access to that power, getting increasingly efficient at extracting useful work out of that source of energy. So we've covered that in different means. But also an important component of getting access to this energy is storage, transportation, things of that nature. And so you can see in a lot of these places, the Romans just don't quite have the technology in place to be able to extract maximum, power from it, or to transport it, or to store it. That's why, slaves and all this stuff is useful, because the power inherent in the humans, they're kind of like little batteries. You can move them around, recharge them, deplete them over time. That's kind of why they relied a lot on the humans and the animals, because you have that key problem of energy storage and time of use that, well, we haven't quite solved just yet. So that's the main comment I'll say here. And one of the things, that's why, perhaps tapping into chemical energy is useful, because you can get this wood, you move the wood, and then you decide when to burn it. So you have an inherent energy source that you can then tap when you need it. So the Romans start to get into that. But really the game changer is going to be when you start to think about, well, water actually is everywhere, but what if you can start to use water as a means to store power, generate power when you need it, and all that stuff in combination with the chemical energy gotten from burning things? And that's basically steam power. And that's going to be the important part that we're talking about, where that's the foundation of a lot of what we do. When you peel off the lid and look under the hood for a lot of the power that we generate from different facilities, ultimately it's all about getting a chemical change from liquid into gas, typically water, maybe some other refrigerant, and then using that to drive turbines that then we extract, useful energy from. And so steam is really the key of what we're doing today. And so how close were the Romans? Well, we could talk about that. And there is this common one that's often compared, which is this alophile from, I believe it's Hero or Heron, from around the 1st century AD. And that's often thought of as, the very start of perhaps steam power. But this is leagues away from what you see in the later 1700s, 1800s. So Chris, maybe you can walk us through some of the differences here.
Yeah, so this is probably going to be the longest little segment that we step on here because I'm just going to do a quick explainer a little bit more of steam power. The reason steam is so useful and it's still frankly widely used today, like we most of our energy is based around steam power, which you don't really necessarily think about, but nuclear power is steam. Chemical power, so your petroleum power plants and your coal power plants, all of that is just steam power. Even some solar panels, like the major solar farms, use steam as a way to store that energy. The magical thing about steam is after it's, turned into water vapor past, 100 degrees Celsius, it stays steam. You can just keep throwing heat into it, and so long as you can contain it properly, you can store a whole bunch of power in the form of heat in that steam. And so that's what we really discovered as time went on. The Romans understood the concept of you make water hot, it turns into steam. But what they didn't really understand was the idea that that is actually in a very simplified term. Engineers can at me in the comments here. It's a battery in some way, shape, or form. It contains all that energy, and then you can use that energy to do something. They had they had a concept of steam and how you can actually make things move with steam, but we don't really quite understand what the Eliopile was, other than a demonstration, a philosophical toy almost, where you put water in this little kettle at the bottom, and when it gets hot, it turns into steam. It goes into this ball at the top, and the ball has a couple of little directional nozzles. And as the steam comes out of the nozzles, it makes the ball spin. It's a great demonstration. In ancient texts, they talk about how that's basically, oh yeah, it's basically just demonstrating how the weather works and how wind works. And look, we can kind of recreate how wind works. And that was a great experiment. But they didn't take it to that next level of making a turbine, which would have essentially the benefit of the turbine is you can take that water wheel, that thing that powered so many machines in the ancient world, and you can put that water wheel anywhere because you can just make it spin with steam. And that's kind of the paradigm shift that the Romans just hadn't quite gotten to. And it took until the 1700s for people to say, wait, we can move things like big things with this steam power if we can get it hot enough. How do we get it to be that hot? Well, coal burns really, really, really well for this. And so that's actually where you see the entire coal industry start off, is when people realize that coal burns hot enough and is very transportable that you can actually make these machines anywhere. And you can make the steam power anywhere by just transporting coal. You don't have to deforest entire things and try to find different forests that you can log. You don't have to plant a forest and wait 30 years for it to become good enough to, set on fire. You can just dig up the coal. It's right there, and, you can burn that. Great. What could possibly go wrong? So that's really where you see the steam revolution come in. And that's why this diagram I've put at the bottom, that's why this steam-based power plant is so much better than a water mill, because you don't have to care about the weather. You don't have to care about the season, like say your river freezes over in the winter, or if there's a drought and your river is just not flowing very well. You don't have to worry about all that because, hey, you've got an artificial water wheel, almost as it were. Is a turbine is just a really, really, really efficient way to do that. And so then you start getting into the idea of harnessing that power and moving that power. And that's really where you get that vast amount of industrialization going on. So what the Romans were missing was that just that little skip of using steam to store power, as opposed to, well, water get hot, water turn into vapor, and that vapor seems to move and makes things spin. That's how the wind works. I mean, yes, but also.
Yeah, and one of the things we'll also say is about the worldview of it all, and kind of we'll get into material sciences and means and methods here, but someone could look in the Roman world, presumably, see that heat this, create steam, steam is causing spinning. They know that they can use turning things to do useful work. So the Romans very much would have understood that. But when you compare this little machine that someone might have crafted at the time and the output that it's doing, maybe they did hook this up to some sort of grain system. And the amount of steam, this thing is just not efficient enough to produce the power necessary. So when they compare this to, say, a water wheel, maybe they did do some tests. They found that, hey, this is just not a useful amount of work. And that's a function of just how inefficient the system was, both in terms of the heating method, the system as it's designed, the material properties of what they have here. So there's a lot going into this where this technology might be smothered in its infancy because of the ease of using water wheels or slave labor or all this other stuff that just makes it so that this isn't quite efficient, because you can't get that efficiency to get the the comparative advantage to make the switch. So that's an important part to talk about. So what do you need to make that switch? Well, we'll get into that here, which is kind of an understanding of material science and kind of the means and methods you have for construction and machinery. So yeah, let's dive into, I guess, the material science property or topic here. So we have subjects dealing with metallurgy in general, steel, glass, Roman concrete. There could be more, but these are the major ones that we've identified.
Yeah, it's actually, a huge topic. Roman industry in general is a gigantic topic, so I'm quite delighted to be able to talk about it with you guys today. Julian's actually found a journal entry here and highlighted some relevant portions of it. So I'm not necessarily going to read all the way through that because I feel that would be a little bit reductive. Feel free to pause the video if you want to read the highlights. But essentially, the Romans mostly had their surface level exploitation. They discovered how to dig deeper mines because sometimes they really exhausted those surface level exploitations. They actually mined so much silver in Spain that they made a second mountain of silver just with this slag that was, the cast-offs from their silver mines. And then that mountain was later mined because the Romans had been kind of inefficient about it, and there was still a bunch of silver left in that slag. So that's one of those interesting illustrations of the Romans did a lot when it came to exploitation. They knew, okay, these are iron-rich ores, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this iron-rich ore, we're going to put it in the furnace, we're going to melt that down, and we're going to get that iron out of it. But what they didn't necessarily understand was the why. Why is this iron superior to this iron? Well, the answer today we might understand is, iron B has a much higher carbon content than iron A, and therefore it is much stronger. The Romans didn't quite understand why. Pliny suggests that maybe it had something to do with the water content at a different place, which, maybe the water had more carbon in it. I am not a carbon scientist, but they didn't really understand the why. They understood the how. They were very, very, very good at exploiting things. They understood metal purity. The best example of that is with their silver coins. Their silver coins, especially in the early empire, were 99.7% pure. They were as close to pure silver as you could possibly get. Frankly, that's still a very, very, very high purity. They were renowned across the world. The Indians loved Roman silver because it was so pure. So that's why you see so many Roman silver coins in India. It's because they essentially just used it as a trading medium. They knew that it was pure silver. They knew exactly how much silver that was worth, and they could trust it. So they traded very heavily for Roman silver. The Romans weren't necessarily able to do that for all metals, though. And that's where we're going to go ahead and get into with regards to steel. And what's the difference between Roman steel, Roman iron, and more modern steels and different types of steel that really, frankly, changed the way the entire world works.
Yeah, and to put a final cap on this idea of metallurgy that covers a lot of things, the Romans were hugely on top of exploiting the resources of their metals and basically taking the raw metal in the ground and then trying to heat it up and extract the useful parts of it. And they had various amounts of success. But as this research article essentially summarizes, the Romans were really good at scaling up the techniques of the day and just producing a lot of good volume of this kind of extraction from raw ores. But they weren't so good at innovating new techniques to increase your efficiency and get to the next level. So they nailed the scale, but they didn't necessarily nail the innovations. And that's kind of where you really need that crux of understanding the next level in order to get better products, in order to then build better machines. And that's all prefaced by having understanding of what's actually on with the materials in the first place. This frame of reference, the scientific theory, all that stuff that maybe prohibited them from doing that instead of just lucking into it through trial and error.
Yeah, and the best example of that is going on a little bit into the steel portion is the idea of the blast furnace. And so what the blast furnace does is it forces a lot more air into whatever you're smelting and is able to make it a lot hotter because you're getting more oxygen into that to that chemical reaction down there. And so you can get much, much, much hotter temperatures, which allows you to purify things to a much higher degree, thus making what we now know as steel. Again, I am very oversimplifying this. Engineers, please continue to at me in the comments telling me how I am oversimplifying things. That process, weirdly, it was actually known to some degree in China. And so we actually have records of the Romans saying that the Chinese have the best iron, they have the best steel in the world. So if you can get Chinese steel anything, do it. It's the best. But second to that, you have stuff from like places like Parthia. So that was actually famous for, quite a long period of time as well, where we now term that as Damascus steel, where it has that beautiful Ripley pattern to it that so many people really like in their knives these days, like their kitchen knives. But even so, no matter what, even with those very, very, very famous metals, iron was relatively expensive. It was cheaper than bronze. It was very, very, very ubiquitous. The Romans used it a lot. But it was still relatively expensive because it took so much work to make. And this goes into what Julian was saying, where the Romans were really good at scaling things up, but with regards to furnaces and such, to scale that up, you need an entirely new process. So it just didn't scale very well. And so they were always stuck with these relatively small scale operations of a couple of guys who were sitting around the furnace, just adding a little bit of iron nitrate here or adding a little bit of flux here just to try to keep it stable and keep the slag flowing off, and then eventually you have a lump of metal at the bottom. Great. That is a relatively inefficient way of doing things, and the Roman forges usually only ran to about 1,000 degrees Celsius. I know, the word only there is doing a lot of work. For perspective, the Chinese forges were running at 1,500 degrees Celsius, so 50% hotter. You can get a significantly better degree of steel, especially because they were blowing some of that air through the iron to clear out more of the impurities, introducing carbon, and burning it more. They had a much better degree of steel in the same period of time, at the same time period than the Romans. The Romans just assumed they just had better iron to dig out of the ground. It's all in the process, and it just comes down to that deep understanding of what's going on here. So in the Industrial Revolution, and really this starts in the mid-1800s, more closer to the mid than to the early, as it were, you have this guy named Bessemer, Henry Bessemer, I believe, and he invents this Bessemer process, which we've actually illustrated up here, where you actually get this steel that's able to be more mass-produced, especially because you have the blast furnace, where you can just dump a huge amount of iron into a huge furnace and make an enormous amount of steel. And so that was able to be scaled up to make immense factories and perhaps the miracle product, cheap steel. And cheap steel, Julian is much more of an engineer than I am, so he can probably talk a little bit more about this, but it completely revolutionized the planet. You have things that could be built, such as the idea of rebar, where it just was too expensive to do before steel was mass producible. So you were able to build bigger buildings. You were able to build more durable buildings and better things with concrete. Better is subjective, but in a practical function, better. You were able to make cheap replaceable parts that were also very, very durable with steel. You were able to make machinery that just worked for longer and didn't break, and it just simply is better than a lot of the alternatives, like, say, stone grinding wheels or stone gears.
Yeah, and the
Steel,
more
yeah, sorry.
well,
Yeah,
no, I was
go
just gonna
ahead.
say, I think your point is noted. Where the more you produce of it, it's just cheaper, and so now it's easier for an industrialist to go ahead and say, I'm going to upgrade all my water mills, and they're going to include steel parts, and now I can, they're much more reliable. I can make them bigger. I can scale up my facilities. You can have more efficiencies. One of the things also that you can do at this point, when you get these high temperatures, is you can start to introduce molds and make more crafted items and get more high precision devices versus before crude method gets crude steel and it's wrought and you have to bang it and you have to quench it and you have to do all this very intensive versus now you start to get into the realm of mass production where it's much more convenient now to start upgrading all your equipment. Rail lines, better ships, that then allows for increased agriculture. Now this is where you get the vicious or the virtuous cycle, I should say, that it starts to improve everything else.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I know you really wanted to cover steel. So this is a huge, important part that flows out into everything else. But there's other material processes also that are going to be kind of important and relevant. One of them we alluded to is, harnessing solar power. We mentioned some idea of lenses and things like that. That kind of gets us into the realm of playing with glass, which can be important for containing things or working with lenses for doing, inspections of things or perhaps reflectors for whatever purpose you might have. But anyways, glass is a whole realm of material sciences that we could talk about that the Romans were definitely very much into, that also
Yeah.
uses high temperatures.
Interestingly enough, I don't want to say the Romans invented glass. They invented glass blowing, which is just as big of a revolution to the idea of, making glass product as the Bessemer process was to steel. So where Julian was saying earlier, like the Romans were very good at scaling, but not necessarily at innovating. This is the area where you can actively see the Romans innovate, because once you discover glass blowing, you realize, oh my gosh, you can make this at mass and therefore it all gets cheaper. Everyone's able to have windows. That's a big deal. Everyone's able to, have drinking cups. Everyone's able to, make jewelry and decorations. The possibilities for glass in this way are, I don't want to say they're endless, but you're able to see an explosion of glassware across the Roman world, which incidentally was another thing that was very highly prized in trade from as far away as India and China, was this Roman glass that was just beautiful. And you could, after you have the idea that you can actually make it in mass, you have all these other ideas of, well, what else can we do with it? And so you see these things like adding different colors to the glass and adding little chips of things inside the glass and just adding more decoration here and there, making it stronger here and there. Essentially, this was, it might be a little bit of an exaggeration here, but to the Romans, glass was about the equivalent of us discovering plastic and the ways you can actually work with plastic, the things you can make with it. And perhaps again, most importantly, they could make it en masse and they could make it cheaply. So when it came to making glass, it wasn't necessarily just made on site. You don't just go to the beach, dig out some sand, and boom, you have glass. That's not how it works. The Romans did use a lot of beach sand, but it was mostly at a couple of very specific places in the Levant. So in the province that they called Palestine, and in Egypt. So that's where you had their flux, their lime, and the sand that they used to make this glass. And they had these huge furnaces and workshops. We've actually found one chunk of glass, I believe it's in modern day Israel, that was actually 8 tons. And so what they would do is they'd make these huge blocks of glass on site at the furnace, and then they just ship the blocks of glass to where they needed to go. And so, like, you ship this 8-ton block over, on a barge to Rome. You don't have to worry about things breaking because glass products break. You don't have to worry particularly about shipping safety, except for the fact that it's a very heavy object. All you have to do is get it from point A to point B, and then the workshops are all on site in Rome that can just, chisel off a chunk, melt it, and blow it. And boom, all of a sudden you have mass production of all of these different elements that you might need for whatever you might need it for. So there's actually documentation of a huge number of both male and female glassblowers that just spring up all throughout the Roman world, which is one of those fascinating aspects that you don't really think about because today glass is so ubiquitous, you don't think of it as being a completely world-changing invention. Maybe you don't even think of, before you listen to this, steel as a world-changing invention. But they both were. And this is one of those things that the Romans figured out how to do, and then they did it really, 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 really well.
And the last one, which even bears its name to today, would be Roman concrete, which is another key thing for building materials. And a kind of an understanding of material sciences, although perhaps for this one they maybe lucked into it through trial and error. But nonetheless, this is one that gains a lot of attention because Roman concrete is well reputed for holding up even to today. People, I think it was the last 5 years, some studies came out finally understanding or trying to piece together the clues for how it was done, how it was built, the key components and all that. But essentially, we'll get into this in a second, but essentially having really good concrete that lasts a long time unlocks many of these massive building projects, be it an aqueduct or a coliseum or whatever. Having these key building materials is really important. So perhaps the Romans didn't have the kind of huge amounts of steel, but at least they had the Roman concrete. And just to recap for what is concrete, it's basically just going to be you take some sort of aggregate, which is a fine or a coarse material, and then you find a way to bind it together, usually with some sort of air or water, with a fine cement-like property, which is going to act as your binder to keep all these elements together. You can make all sorts of different types of concrete, and like I was alluding to, we only just recently start to get an understanding of the Roman concrete, why it was so special. But Chris, I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, so Roman concrete is almost mythologized in the modern day. Some of, those funny Facebook memes that all of you guys have probably seen, or, if you're not on Facebook because you're not an old person, you might have seen it on TikTok, where it's like all these Roman roads. Wow, these Roman roads have held up so well. Let's look at a modern. Oh, look at all those potholes. Those are a lot. So it's mythologized a little bit in a lot of ways. And people talk about, oh, why don't we just use Roman concrete for everything? Well, part of that is survivorship bias. We don't see all the Roman concrete that didn't work out. We don't see all the stuff that fell down. And there's a lot of stuff that fell down. It's just the way things work. Second, the concrete the Romans had, it was exceptionally good and exceptionally strong. And could only be really made with the ingredients. Like, they got their aggregate that Julian was mentioning. They got that almost entirely from places like the Italian peninsula, where they had a lot of volcanic activity. So they used very, very coarse aggregate, a very chunky thing there. And they used quicklime as one of the binders for it. So the quicklime would essentially really help it to set, and that would make for a really good concrete. Today, we like smooth concrete because we like things that are actually flat. I don't know how else to put that. We like things that are flat, and we like buildings that are, actually you can work with it a lot better. Both of them have, their strengths, their weaknesses, etc. I'm not saying Roman concrete is better or worse than modern concrete, but they do fulfill slightly different functions. We'll have to do a full episode on concrete sometime later. But the Romans discovering concrete also, it completely revolutionized how they built things. And they were able to build much larger buildings, much faster, much cheaper, and much more efficiently than if they were just having to import stone blocks for everything. Because importing stone blocks is really expensive. Putting together concrete is pretty relatively cheap. So you have, and the Romans even were able to build things like installations in the water. So that's one of those big famous things they're able to do, is they're able to sink massive pillars into the water to build harbors or bridges or what have you. And they're able to use the cement to hold it there. And because their cement is partly made with quicklime heats up when it's hit with water in any shape, way, or form. And thus it sets the cement. So the cement basically hardens really, really, really well, even when it's being used underwater.
And we could go on with different aspects of material sciences, but you could start to get a sense that Rome is quite sophisticated, some ways more than others, but for the most part, you get some innovation, but it's not quite getting you to that breakthrough that you need to really ultimately just get the high temperatures and levels of precision to really get to that next level of material sciences. And much of that is held back by just the overall understanding of the world and how it functions instead of just trial and error. And then, now we can pivot on to the next part, which is, okay, you have all these materials and you're refining them, but what do you do with them? What do you build with them? So again, means and methods, there's lots of different ways to present this. Just generally speaking, I wanted to talk about the different types of machines that Romans had that we might think are reserved to our own day and age, but we find in the Roman age, and then kind of the scale of things for mass production. And we can start here with machinery. Again, we've just handpicked some that are a bit more eye-catchy. Chris, I guess if you wanted to talk about these, you could, but some that are ubiquitous in our world that we might not expect in the Roman age is going to be ball bearings or things like gears, which are kind of the crux to making machines work, to turn, to rotate, to operate. And the Romans had them.
Yeah. We don't necessarily... So when Julian first asked me this question of how industrialized were the Romans? Could they have had an industrial revolution? Well, the answer is they were really, 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 really smart. They were very clever people. They were very good at working with the things they had. And so these ball bearings that Julian's actually showing here, they were used on an emperor's pleasure ship. It's one of two ships called the Nemi ships. If you want to go ahead and look those up, keep watching the video, but look them up afterwards. These were ball bearings that were put in statue bases to allow the statues to rotate. It was, again, a very relatively mundane thing. But today, when we think of ball bearings, those are essential in practically all things you can think of with wheels. So your trains, you need the ball bearings for that. Those need to be precision machined. They need to be all exactly the same size, and they need to all work the exact same way, or else it's just not going to work all that well. It's going to be a little bit wobbly. Even with their technology, the Romans were able to do some level of this precision manufacture that you wouldn't necessarily expect from people who were very much pre-industrial in a world where steel is not ubiquitous. And so you have them inventing these things like, again, it seems like such a small thing, but ball bearings, these immensely complicated gears that seem to, every few years, it seems like we find another location with one of these water wheels that sports a very complex set of gear work, that maybe one side of this diagram was used for grinding grain and the other was used for sawing logs. You could do both. Why not? And this was found in Israel, in a river in Israel. So, and of course, you have these places especially well preserved in more arid areas, just simply as a result of the habitat. And then we have things like the Antikythera mechanism. We don't actually 100% know the full functionality of the Antikythera mechanism, but we know that it was very, very, very complex. We found it in a shipwreck, and essentially it was a full navigation device. Remember how I mentioned that they were very good at predicting things, even though they thought the Earth was the center of the solar system? Well, this is the demonstration of that, effectively. It could predict the moon cycles, which is pretty important for a sailor. It could tell you where the stars were going to be, so how to navigate. It could tell you, frankly, it could probably predict the tides in some way, shape, or form. So this stuff is all really, really, really complex. It's known as the first computer for a reason. And it shows that we only scratch the surface of, like, how industrialized can we call the Romans, as they already were, even, without this theory crafting of a Roman industrial revolution. I argue that in some ways they were more industrialized than we give them credit for today.
Yeah, and one thing we would point out here is the gears is all about transferring power, and we've talked about the power that they're exploiting. This is all about what can you do with that power? So the gears is a key component of that, where you can change the direction, turn rotational power into something that's, back and forth or up and down or different things. Or even the Antikythera mechanism shows that you can turn rotation and use different gear sizes to change the amount that you're rotating, the degrees that you're rotating. An input becomes a different output. So it shows a complexity of understanding of what you can do with this power. And one of the things I brought down here is it's kind of it's a banality kind of that they use a lot of this to actually have water clocks. And I love these machines where it's almost like a Rube Goldberg machine to tell the time of day. And the Romans had this. And so you can see here, water comes in, it has a riser that allows for this pointer, but then the water is coming, it's turning a water wheel. You have all sorts of gear rotations and different pairings of gear ratios to finally turn something that's finely tuned to align with an observation in nature, which is going to be the time of day, time of year, things like that. So they did have these complex machines, and they had them at scale in some cases, like we're showing here with these big aqueduct and water mill facilities. They had these screws, pumps, cranes, torsion used in artillery. So huge, pretty complex machines that we could discuss.
Yeah, and a lot of these, I'm not going to go too deep into all these machines just because we could talk for hours about this. Some of these cranes, I like to joke, one of the original punishments for prisoners was to basically do cardio. So what they do with some of these cranes, like, for example, if they didn't have a water wheel, they actually invented one that you have two people inside, and they basically just pull a hamster wheel, and they rotate the wheel themselves with human power. And that crane could pull probably as much as 50 people just because of mechanical efficiency. These pumps and the Archimedes screw and such like that, they were often used for raising water. And that raising water could be, frankly, for a lot of different things. Some of them were actually used to power aqueducts. Like, you just raise water into an aqueduct so that the people downstream could get more water. Obviously, this would be a regular job or something you would assign a group of slaves to do just to keep that water flowing. But another big use was, again, with mining. When you get below the water table, your mines flood. It's just, they fill with water and you can't really dig when you're trying to dig underwater. It doesn't work. So you need a way to get rid of that water. So they had these Archimedes screws, which you just turn it and it pulls water up. Maybe it's relatively efficient by the modern idea, but it's way better than going down there with buckets. And you can actually reduce that water level so that you can continue mining. And all of these things, again, they're really fascinating different devices that the Romans were able to innovate or invent based on their situation, based on what they needed, and based on what they understood was possible. So that's why you see so much of this. And again, this is where my classic argument is. Well, in some ways, the Romans were a pretty industrialized empire. And maybe not in the modern sense, but in their sense, they absolutely were.
Yeah, and one last hallmark of industrialization would be factories. I just want to finish on this perhaps point, which is we think of, scaling things up, and we've already talked quite broadly about the large scale of projects the Romans had, but they were starting to tinker with the idea of mass production. Chris, you talked about that with the glass, where you have these huge slabs of glass that are then brought into these places where they can chip it out and make a bunch of stuff en masse. And so you have these workshops and fabrica and large facilities. There's evidence of, I think, the Carthaginians coming up with this, where you have different planks of wood marked with all of the same number, showing evidence that they were going to cut everything to the same size and assemble it the same way. So they had these ideas of making things en masse at scale. You noted here ceramics, brickworks, marble, olive oil, garum, all sorts of things. So yeah, it just goes to show that when you kind of zoom out here and you look at a lot of these kind of hallmarks of industrialization, the Romans are starting to tick a lot of boxes. But to zoom back out even further and kind of return to our initial idea, it's kind of the concert of all of these things coming together and really being built up and interplaying with one another that they didn't quite have that. They needed another maybe a couple hundred years or 1,000 years baking in the oven. But knowing exactly how much time the Romans needed to go through an equivalent industrial revolution is not something we can really, it's impossible to judge. But yeah, I think this is our relatively abridged take on how close were the Romans to an industrial revolution. And yeah, I think we've, we can double back and do further case studies if you guys want to look at concrete or steel or other topics. But I think this is our somewhat succinct take on it. Chris, do you have any final thoughts maybe?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's funny to say succinct when we've spent, a couple hours talking about this, but it's just an infinitely deep question. It's really, really, really exciting to try to answer it. And so I'm just really happy to be able to have discussed this with you guys.
Yep. So again, if you guys enjoyed this, let us know in the comments below. Happy to revisit this in future episodes. Maybe make a really succinct, distilled version of this if it's helpful. But yeah, I always like these more open format, deep dive discussions. So again, thank you, Chris, for joining us. And thank you all for following along. We'll see you in the next one.